Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for this TLA Talks on how to connect with your elected officials with confidence. We have some great presenters here today and look forward to a really interactive and productive session. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we kick it off. This session is being recorded and we'll post it on the TLA website and share it with all registered attendees here in a couple of days later this week. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and make sure that in the drop down where in the to that it's to everyone, not just to panelists. Make sure that you post to everyone so we can all see the questions. And if you have any resources that you'd like to share, please paste those in the chat as well. So now I am going to turn it over to Manya Shorr, who is the director of the Fort Worth Public Library and the chair of TLA's Legislative Committee.
Thanks, Wendy. Hi, everyone. Why don't we get started in the chat? I'm going to ask you to put your name and where you're from, whether that's library or ISD or school name, just something that gives our panelists a sense of who they're talking to today. And I want to make sure that that chat function works. So Wendy and I will be watching the chat the whole time and keeping track of the questions that you have. So don't worry if it gets lost in the scroll, we'll be taking a look at it. As Wendy said, my name is Manya Shorr, and I'm the director of the Fort Worth Public Library in Fort Worth, Texas, and I am your chair of the TLA Legislative Committee. As you know, we are always asking you to connect with your elected officials so that they know you exist and they know it's important to you and that hopefully they will advocate on our behalf. But I also know how scary that can be and how hesitant many of us can be in actually taking the first step to do that. So what we're going to do today is we have asked a couple of outside library experts to help you really get the ball rolling. How do you do that? What do you say? What's the most impactful? Is this lobbying or is it not? Are you allowed to talk to your elected officials? What are the words that you should use? So I'm going to let them introduce yourself, but I just noticed that Wendy posted that chat is disabled. So please post in the Q&A. And while they're introducing themselves, I'm going to go see if I can figure out how to access the Q&A so I can keep track. So in that Q&A, go ahead and if it's appropriate, tell us where you're from. And without further ado, I'll ask Andrew Fortune to introduce himself, please. And
thank you so much. Well, my name is Andrew Fortune. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations with the City of Plano, Texas. For those of you who aren't familiar, Plano is just north of Dallas, a city of just shy of 300,000 individuals. We are the headquarters for businesses like Toyota. And I have been working with legislative affairs in some form or fashion now for the past 6-7 years. And I just rounded out my first year here in Plano. So looking forward to a great legislative session upcoming and a great conversation today with all of y'all.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And Sophie, you want to introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie Torres. I'm the Regional Advocacy Director for Raise Your Hand Texas in San Antonio, Texas. We're an education nonprofit that really focuses on policy and advocacy for public education. A little bit about my background. I have been working in politics, policy, and advocacy for about 13 years at this point. And so I have worked for nonprofits, the private sector, the public sector, and everything else in between. So I am excited for this conversation because we need everyone's voice heading into a phenomenal legislative session that's starting pretty soon.
And by phenomenal, I think you mean terrible, Sophie, since these are never easy. The Andrew equivalent in Fort Worth always gets up every year and says, this is going to be the worst legislative session we've ever had. It just seems to get worse for us and for local control. So let me not go down that negative path. And let me start by asking the two of you, and for the group, Q&A is working. Hopefully the two of you have found that, how to access it and look at it, but I'll keep an eye on it. We're going to spend a couple of minutes asking these two questions, sort of basic questions. You're welcome to ask basic questions in the Q&A, and then we're going to turn it over to each of them for about 10 minutes. Sophie will focus on best practices in school districts and that focus, and then Andrew will focus on sort of public, and we can hit on academic if there's any academic here. So we have a nice mix going on. So let me start with this pretty basic question. Am I allowed, as a government employee, whether it's municipal government or an ISD, am I allowed to advocate with elected officials for my library, for my institution? Either one of you, Andrew, why don't you start?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say yes, with a caveat that especially in a city and certainly within a school district, it's always great to make sure that you're on the same page with your organization. And always make sure that you're identifying yourself when you talk to a legislator or a staff member for who you're representing. So if you're down there representing yourself, just make sure to make that distinction. If you are representing your organization, make sure you work through either your intergovernmental relations officer, or perhaps your manager or city manager, superintendent, whatever that equivalent is, to make sure everybody's on the same page. You can also advocate on behalf of the Texas Library Association. I'm not sure of your structure, but I'm assuming y'all would adopt priorities and things that would fall in line with that. So I'm sure they would love to have you advocate on their behalf in certain instances. And so that's kind of a roundabout answer for that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And Sophie, can you speak to how important it is when you speak to your elected official and being their constituent at the same time? So actually living in their district, is that more powerful than just say working in their district when you talk to them?
Oh, absolutely. Because in an elected official's eyes, that means you're a voter. That means you have a lot of power in if that person gets reelected or not, or stays in that position. So as a constituent, those are very powerful words when an elected official or an office hears, I'm a constituent and this is how I feel and think, because that equals voter in their mind.
So you recommend making it very clear, saying, I live in your district.
It is always very helpful when you're talking to an elected official, if you live in that district, if that is your voting district, to say, I am a constituent, I am a voter, because they will more than likely pay a lot closer attention to what you say and also remember who you are. They will make a mental note of that Sophie Torres in this district visited, and I'm going to follow up because she is a voter. I want to make sure that she realizes that I know her name. I want to make sure that she remembers that she came to talk to me about all these things and that I remember what important her issues were.
Yep, that makes perfect sense. I see Andrew nodding. You agree? Yes, good. Sometimes in my experience, I think I'm going to talk to an elected official, but I end up sort of being shuffled off to a staffer. That's either if I go to their office to meet with them and then I meet with some very young staff member, or sometimes when they come to my library to a program, the elected official is busy doing the story time and I'm left standing next to a staffer. Can you talk a little bit, first of all, is that just as powerful as talking to the elected? Because are they gatekeepers? Do they have power? Is it good to talk to them? And secondly, what is it that you should say and focus on when you're talking to the staffer instead of the elected official? Either one of you.
I'll start off by saying, like, I was a former staffer, so I completely know the shuffling around. And I know when I was 22 working at the US Capitol, no one wants to talk to you, but somehow or another they end up talking to you. And so, yes, and what I want to say is that the staffers do not know, just like elected officials do not know what's going on in your library. They have no idea what's going on the policy level. They are fresh out of college, or maybe they have 1 or 2 legislative sessions under their belt. There's a lot of high turnover when it comes to working in elected officials' offices. So they need to hear from you continuously to know what's really going on. Yes, it's a little discouraging sometimes because you're hoping to meet with the elected official, but sometimes the staffer can help point you in a really better direction and know what's going on with bill movement. If you're talking about a specific bill, they might know who's talking about what when it comes to other offices. They might know a lot more information about kind of the process of where things are than the actual elected official is. And honestly, they provide a lot of just great information, and they do gatekeep, but if that staffer has been with an elected official for some time, that also means they're a trusted asset for that elected official, and they have the ear of that individual. And so they'll be able to say, hey, I spoke to this person that talked a lot about libraries. I really think we should hear them out, or I really think we need to visit with them a little bit more and provide that type of information and background and have your back a lot of times. The staffer can be a really big asset when you're advocating for your causes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. What surprised me when I started meeting with elected officials in DC was how many staffers they have who've never lived here and maybe never even been to the district, and yet I'm trying to talk to them about my library. Any tips for, I don't know how often that'll happen to participants on this, but certainly on a phone call, you could be talking to a staffer outside of the state who really doesn't even know where your city is. It's a little awkward. Any advice?
I would say just kind of remind them, that you are, in the district, and then provide landmarks. Big landmarks are always a good helpful thing, like, hey, the library is close to Plano City Hall, or this other part from the stockyards in Fort Worth and things like that. The staffers might not know the district itself, but they'll always remember landmarks for their district. So if you're able to kind of pinpoint a little bit for them in their mind, hey, we're close to X, they'll at least have a general geographical area of where that you're at.
One thing I just want to tag on real quick, and I absolutely echo everything Sophie said, but especially going into a hyper politically charged session like what we're about to go into, sometimes your staffers are a great buffer. You have your representatives, and I love them dearly, but they have their political stances and their platforms and the things they say for the camera. And that may be difficult, particularly with what's going on with libraries right now, to have that conversation. So a staffer can be a nice buffer where you can communicate what it is that your library is doing, or what it is that you're trying to get across, and avoid some of those uncomfortable conversations, depending on which elected official represents you.
Andrew, we didn't plan this, but you really gave me the great segue to the question I want to ask you next. And I'll just say, it looks like our chat is working. Will someone out there please type in there and verify that it is working? I would love to. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Oh, hello, Libby. Look, Andrew, Libby's here. Libby from Plano. Good. Okay, great, everyone. I'm going to close the Q&A. Go ahead and use the chat, please. So, Andrew, we've had this come up a couple of times as we've been talking to members about their elected officials. A lot of us feel under attack right now. And it feels very personal. And I've heard members express that makes it difficult to talk to their elected officials, especially the ones who are putting some of these potential policies or laws into place. I mean, I'll say I run a library system that happens to be in Representative Krause's district. So when he put out that list of books, you guys might be too, Andrew, I'm not sure, but when he put out that list of books, it was like, whoa, this is very personal, right? We're in your district. So can you give tips? How do you talk to an elected official that either you're feeling very strongly negative towards, or you're not sure how to talk to them? There has to be ways to sort of circumvent and create relationships with people, with elected officials that you strongly disagree with. How do you both go about doing that?
Well, yeah, definitely. I'm actually very familiar with Representative Krause. I've worked in the city of Grand Prairie prior, so I worked with his office quite a bit. I point back to certainly using the staffers as a buffer, but also, at least it helps me, I advocate on behalf of the city council. So an entire group of 8 individuals and ultimately a community with differing ideas, backgrounds, deeply held beliefs. And it helps me to remember who it is that I'm serving. And it kind of helps me self-check when I have an emotional response or I have a personal opinion that may rise to that, to understand that, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, and understanding that sometimes biting our tongue and moving forward past that and understanding that, there are political realities that are at play. Some elements of these controversial issues are deeply held beliefs. And the great thing about where we live is that we can all have deeply held beliefs. And sometimes they're not always going to match, but you can always remember there's a person who can be respected so far as it depends on each of us. And again, yeah, and also finding common ground. I think that's a really important thing. And oftentimes your district is your common ground. Pointing out that, we may differ on this particular issue, but I'm here maybe not to change your mind, but to provide education on a different perspective, and really approaching it as an educational opportunity more than an advocacy, or you probably aren't going to change the minds of everybody that you visit with on those issues. So it's just my thoughts.
That's great. Sophie, did you want to add to this one?
I just want to echo what Andrew said. I think as with it being so politically charged right now, there is a lot of space for common ground, but it's getting past those difficult conversations, or just getting past choosing not to have those difficult conversations for the sake of finding common ground sometimes. And really remembering, to Andrew's point, who are you really serving in this? Is it going to be self-serving yourself because you don't want to have this conversation with this individual because you disagree with them on a personal level, or moving past that because you're looking for additional funding for your library, you're looking for additional resources, and really use that as an educational point, as Andrew mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's great. Victoria's asking, so let's say you've made that assessment and decided that this issue is worth bringing up with the elected official. How would you go about bringing it up?
I've always found success with acknowledging that it's going to be a difficult conversation at the get-go, and simply saying, hey, I've requested to meet with you. I appreciate you taking the time. Always thank them. Their time is precious. And really saying, hey, we're about to talk about X, and I understand your position has been publicly this on X. I'm here to provide a different perspective from your district, from an area that X impacts, and then start it off from there. And one, also read the room and see if that representative is still receptive to have that conversation, and kind of understand too that it may be a very short conversation where you plan to provide a lot of extra information. So that's how I've had success in the past.
Great. Sophie, you're welcome to add something, but then I'm just going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
No,
whenever
I was
you're
just
ready.
to Andrew's point where he was talking about staff being the buffer. Maybe the individual, the elected official, doesn't want to have that conversation and chooses not to, but that's still a conversation that you can have with a staffer, having those hard questions and having that hard conversation to.
Yeah, I think what both of you are saying is really brilliant. First of all, ask why are you trying to have this conversation? Is it just to sort of download your frustration with them, on them? Does it serve a purpose? Because we feel personally attacked, some of us want to lash out, and that's just not good long-term thinking a lot of the time. But if you do decide to bring it up, to Victoria's point, I like this idea, Andrew, where you start with, this is going to be a difficult topic, but I feel like as your library director, or your whatever, your school librarian, I feel a need to express it to you, and just keep it with this tone and this relaxed, not combative and not attacking. And it just might go well, or they might walk away from you. You take that risk every time. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Sophie to begin her presentation. And if you have questions for her, please put them in the chat, and Wendy and I will keep track of them, and we'll make sure they get answered. So Sophie, do you have the ability to take over? Okay, great. It's all yours.
Let me share my screen with you guys. I'm just going to go over some quick information of why advocacy matters, and some tips and tricks to kind of use as you're going through your advocacy journey in the next coming months. A little bit about Raise Your Hand Texas, in case you're wondering who we are and what we do. We support public policy solutions that invest in our students, encourage innovation and autonomy, and improve college and workforce readiness. We do this through a variety of ways. We do it through policy analysis and development, looking at what's out there in the education space. We do it through relationships on the grassroots and grassroots level. So that means relationships with students, teachers, parents, and then all the way up to elected officials and state leadership. And then we do it through legislative advocacy as well. And one thing we really like to say is, what is advocacy? We keep talking about it. It's just public support or recommendation for a particular issue or cause. We focus primarily on public education. That is the wheelhouse and lane that Raise Your Hand Texas really stays in. And ultimately, advocacy is because you're trying to enact change. And that's why we're doing advocacy, and that's why you do that. And we like to think of advocacy in a 24-month cycle. When you really think about it, a lot of folks think about the end, the activation part, as the beginning of your advocacy journey, but it really starts immediately after the legislative session ends, with educating folks, educating elected officials and staff, engaging in the process with voting and elections, and then having all those building blocks to really advocate and activate individuals and policymakers to support you in favor or oppose specific legislation. So this is kind of how we frame advocacy as an organization. We like to educate, engage, and activate. For Raise Your Hand Texas, we really focus in on the state level just because that is where a lot of the public education funding and process and laws kind of impact classrooms. Here's just some information. These slides will also be available. I'll make sure that they're shared with everyone. But ultimately, why does advocacy matter? And it's because policy decisions do not happen in a vacuum, and there's constant competing priorities. Not expressing your priorities is a competing priority. Being silent is a competing priority. And we like to say that education policy is for what's best for all students. We also like to remind folks that advocacy is not lobbying. You're educating policymakers on how something impacts students, how something impacts citizens and individuals that frequent your library. And you're also getting policymakers' intention. You want them to be informed legislators to legislate better. They need to be informed to be able to legislate. And ultimately, advocacy is about power building. And power is measured by our collective abilities to successfully advance our agenda together, and making it unthinkable that anyone would ever be against what we all collectively believe in. And so when you're thinking about this, there's low, moderate, and high time commitments that kind of fall into place of what can I do? That's generally a question I hear from a lot of folks of like, well, but what can I do? Kind of depends on how much time you have. If you're looking for low time commitment advocacy avenues, you can just follow people on social media, follow your state representatives, but on all different levels, making sure kind of what are they talking about on Twitter a lot, what's coming up constantly for them. You can read about politics and policy. The Texas Tribune does a really great job in covering the entire state on a plethora of issues. And you can connect with advocacy groups that kind of really align with your causes and what are they doing. Signing up for their emails is a really great way to just have things in the inbox. Raise Your Hand Texas sends a really great email out every Friday during the legislative session on education policy. That's generally 1 thing to do and 5 things to know. Really broken down into key pieces that kind of makes you understand what's going on, but also keeps you informed. If you're looking for a little bit more time, moderate time commitment on the advocacy front, you can attend candidate forums, making sure you're educated and voting in every election, making sure you're getting your friends to vote in every election as well. You can follow legislative activity and such. And then if you really want to get into advocacy and you have tons of time, maybe not tons, but you have some, this is like, that over an hour time commitment. You can provide public comment, you can testify at a hearing, you can call and meet with elected officials and their staff. As we mentioned, staffs are very important. If you're at a school district, you can invite them to your campus, to your library, to story time, and then also becoming a deputy voter registrar so you can make sure that everyone is registered to vote moving forward. Here are some legal do's and don'ts when it comes to voting, but you can also kind of apply them to advocacy from our Friends of Texas Educators Vote. And so really, I want to focus in on really the don'ts, because those are always the most important thing. And it's really, don't use public funds or don't use your school system school resources to support or oppose a specific candidate, party, or ballot measure. That's really the biggest one that I think people kind of get hung up on. And really it's really about the time and how you're using it. But these are just some basic do's and don'ts when it comes to voting, but I think can really translate into advocacy as well. For your school structure, Andrew kind of touched on this. Many school districts have a person who handles legislative affairs, whether formally or informally. Larger school districts generally have a government affairs person or an external relations individual. Find out who that is and befriend them if you're looking into getting into, advocating on behalf of your library and your school. Ask your district what their priorities are and making sure that they align with them. Some districts have very specific district priorities, whether it's maybe funding or something specific. And there's other districts that are part of regional coalitions that have like a greater mission together. Find out kind of where your district lies and take it from there. And then always find a buddy and find someone else in your district that shares the passion and advocate with a friend. It's always easier to kind of go through this journey or advocate when someone's there with you and able to push you along and kind of be each other's backup. It's also just easier and less scary when you have a friend doing it with you, especially if you're new to advocacy. So what to do if you have a meeting with an elected official? I would say always explain who you are and credential yourself. You all are professionals. As librarians, you went to college, you got a master's in library science, you spent so many years in this profession. People need to hear that, because if you're talking to a 22-year-old staffer, they have no idea about any of that. They need to hear it that I have been a librarian for 20 plus years. These are all my credentials, and make sure you're establishing yourself as an expert in this field. Always say keep it short and sweet, the who, what, when, where, and why, and how, with personal stories and data. I remember in middle school when you learned how to write a persuasive paper, you have your introduction, your conclusion, and then like 3 reasons why with supporting arguments. That's really how you're going to structure a meeting. It's really perfect of here I am, this is credentialing myself, here's what I want to talk about, and these are the issues, and here's my conclusion. And that's really a great framework of how to have a really successful meeting. And then lastly, always have a leave behind when you're in a meeting, whether it's in a digital format or a paper format. 1 page, front and back, add some color, not too much information, great infographics that maybe just says who you are and what you're doing and why, and that's it. These are really helpful in making sure you include your contact information, because as a staffer, there are days where I had 10 meetings in a row. And by the end of it, I had no idea who I was done talking to. But if I was cleaning my desk or at the end of the week going through my papers, I would see, hey, I met with that library association group and they had some really cool information. And oh, wow, this is a great leave behind that now I know more information about. That's going to make me remember things. And as a staffer, sometimes that's what helped me understand of who to talk to and when it comes to later down the road, when it comes to certain, bills that are coming up or wanting to get more information. So this is just some basic information. This is the House website of like the upcoming committee hearings that are going on. I wanted to kind of show you guys how easy it is to provide public comment actually, because now it is all digital thanks to COVID. So this is like one of the fun things that we are now able to do that you can do. And it takes like 20 minutes, if that. So here's an example, these are all the committee hearings that were going on. We're going to click on the notice on this one. And then this is what it gives you. This is what the hearing is going to be about. And then right here on all of these notices, it has this paragraph that says Texas residents who wish to electronically submit comment related to agenda items on this notice without testifying in person can do so until the hearing is adjourned by visiting this website. You click on the website, it gives you this. And then all you have to say is you certify that you are a Texas resident, enter your information, and then you can make your comments. And that's it. This is public comment on the House side. It takes, like I said, less than 10 minutes if you want to craft a perfect response. But this is a great way to have your voice heard as a constituent, as an individual who really cares about this matter. Another great way to think, this is capital.texas.gov. This is the website that has all the information for the House and the Senate. You're just kind of looking and finding out, like, I want to advocate, but I'm not too sure how, or want to look at bills. That's more of the lane that you're interested in. This provides really great information of how a bill becomes a law. Sometimes you got to understand that one. And a lot of just other great resources of when you're trying to see how to go. So when you're during the legislative session, once the session starts, what do you do? How do you do it effectively? Visit the legislative offices, whether it's in Austin in the district, join organizations like TLA. I'm sure you guys have a legislative day or some sort of legislative day planned. And those are always helpful because that's a greater organization doing the work together. Follow the committees that are really impact your jurisdiction as well. And sometimes even those that maybe don't follow your jurisdiction. So for example, we always are following the House and Senate Public Education Committee, but also when it comes to funding as well, Article 3, when it comes, so there's different committees as well. Also keep notes. So this one, the tip at the end, elected officials love to hear solutions and then take credit for it. So if you're coming in with a problem, 9 times out of 10, they might ask you, well, how would you solve that? Have some solutions in the back of your mind, in your back pocket, because they might ask you for that. And so if you're coming in with like, these are my problems and this is what I want to address, come with a solution as well, because they're always looking to take credit for something like that. And then you can say, hey, I did that. I made sure they knew this is how to do it. At Raise Your Hand, I am one of 12 at the moment. And so we are regional advocacy directors. We're across the state from Amarillo to Brownsville and everywhere in between, and able to help you kind of start an advocacy journey if that's what you're interested in. And we're able to help whoever, and really not just public school librarians or anything like that. We're really able to help whoever wants to join the advocating for their city, for their community more. And so some final thoughts on advocacy. It's all about local connection. And that's really the key in changing policy. It's building relationships that demonstrate impact over time. So it's building relationships now through the legislative session and afterwards, not just during the 5 months every 2 years that we're in session. This is a long-term relationship building because advocacy requires action. It's a sustained culture of advocacy that we're all trying to have together. And the challenges ahead are huge, but so are the opportunities, especially if we take them on together. And so as you muddle through today, or maybe on your drive home, if you're not home yet, these are some questions you should ask yourself as you're thinking about how to advocate, or how do you advocate, is what is your organization's relationship with advocacy, whether it's a city, whether it's a school district, whether it's a particular library, and then who leads those advocacy efforts on behalf of education, libraries, or whoever in your community, and how do I plug myself in there? I know that was a lot of information, but happy to take any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Actually, Sophie, before you stop sharing your screen, we did have a question on what was the link for testifying online? Not the one where you could submit a comment, but the one where you can sign up to testify. Would you mind going back to that in your presentation?
Sure. So it's a little complicated because I went through a various. So here, you're going to go on the capital.texas.gov. You're going to go to today's calendar, and then it'll bring up a calendar, and then you kind of highlight on the day. You can also go to House and look at schedules. So this is house.texas.gov, and look at schedules, and then it'll give you the committee schedules for the week, or the ones that are scheduled. And then when you click on the notice, that's where you'll get the actual notice for that particular hearing that's happening. And then when you click on the comments, it'll take you to the screen, and then you can pick which, for this specific example of the jurisprudence committee, you can pick on what exactly you want to submit comment on.
Is there no way to testify through webcam like this? That was my interpretation of Julie's question. Julie, if I misread, let me know, but I thought you were asking about testifying. She says testifying online, which I think to me is different than submitting a comment. Is there a way to sign up to do that?
I have seen it done. I am
Okay.
not 100% sure though, exactly.
It's usually only whenever the committee itself, it's usually only on the House side and only if for the invited testimony in
Maybe that's
very
it.
limited circumstances.
Mhm.
Well, and it turns out I misread. Julie did mean submitting a comment. So I think you went back through that clearly. And I think, Julie, that Wendy dropped some links in the chat that you can follow. Great. Thank you, Sophie, very much. I appreciate you saying that you have to really create the relationship, not when the crisis occurs, but before. If you know me, you know I've been doing that with Congresswoman Granger's office for almost 4 years now, and I only just now got her to come to a story time. It has taken years and years to get her to come to something. And when I got her there, you know, I did not talk to her about book challenges or anything having to do with censorship. That may come in a couple of years. So it really is playing the long game, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate you saying that every ISD or most ISDs have some kind of intergovernmental position or person that is echoed in a lot of municipalities. Fort Worth has one. Andrew with Plano's. Maybe Andrew can sort of, as he's talking about best practices, I don't know, Andrew, if you're aware, sort of what level of city or what size of city that case cascades down to. And for smaller cities, and Sophie, this may be a question for later for you, for smaller ISDs, there are often consortium, that's maybe not the right word, but regional representatives. So maybe a county or a county of governments, council of governments, something like that, Andrew. So I'll stop giving your presentation for you and turn it over to you for best practices in public, in the municipal government space.
Well, thank you. Well, Sophie, excellent presentation. And she absolutely covered, one of the main things I definitely want to echo is relationships. That's really 99% of what any kind of advocacy is built on. And she's absolutely right. Those relationships need to happen really all the time. It's an ongoing process. And, there's really, I call it opportunities to shine. But really your library every library has something special going on about it, whether it's a new renovation, whether it's a new display, if it's a specific set of programming. And legislators specifically outside of the legislative session immediately following, assuming we don't have 4 special sessions, they are really interested in getting back into the district. And a lot of them are interested. I know it's easy to get jaded and to think that, everything that an elected official does is for votes, but most of them got in there because they wanted to affect change, and they are in there for the right reason. And I encourage everybody to not lose sight of that whenever you see a lot of the things on the news and hot button issues pop up, but really taking those opportunities to shine as an organization and really implementing programs. If you don't currently have a legislator who may be as interested in coming, say, to a story time or to a specific event, oftentimes you can go to their office and to their staffers and offer your facility, because in addition to your own programming, you have a phenomenal facility, and legislators are always looking for opportunities to host an event. Obviously, as Sophie mentioned, it can't be anything political, staying out of any running for re-election. But if they're looking for a space to hear back from the community on specific issues, for them to have in the back of their mind that, hey, the Plano Library is a location that's central within my district, and they're open to partnering with me on that. That's an opportunity for you to certainly pursue. I do want to echo back that you really do need to, especially in cities, which is the perspective I'm coming from, to route everything that you do through your manager, your city manager, your government relations officer. If you don't have a government relations officer, certainly your town administrator or city manager. For Plano and for a lot of cities across the state, we adopt legislative agendas or priorities, and that I joke that's my legislative Bible. That's what I don't deviate from whenever I go down there, and that really gives someone like me the authority and the city manager, and by extension, you as librarians, the authority to go down on behalf of the organization. And that is something that's crucial if you ever do find yourself in a situation where you're testifying, to make sure that you have some sort of authoritative document. Something, because there have been many times where we've had individuals down in Austin on particularly contentious issues where a legislator may ask, who are you speaking on behalf of? And who gave you the authority to be down there to speak? And so it's important for you to make sure that you have an answer to those kind of questions. But, you know, one thing that I've found in the many sessions I've done, no surprises. That's one thing that I would encourage you to do in your areas. If there are opportunities for you to give staffers a heads up, if you see something on Twitter, you see something that's blown up in your city or in a neighboring region, or even in your area, reaching out proactively to the staff of your representatives and letting them know, hey, I understand this issue just happened. This issue is now trending on Twitter. You may or may not be aware of it. And even if it's on an issue that you have a differing opinion, sometimes it's just nice and works towards that relationship building where they feel like, okay, I have an advocate in the district, in the area for libraries that really is going to be proactive and visiting with me. And akin to that would be responsiveness. It's a bit of a selfish ask since I am a government relations person, but if, you know, a member of your staff or even of TLA reaches out and says, hey, we have this issue come up and we really need information, we need an example, something, the sooner that you can turn that back around for staff or for a legislator even, the better that is going down the road. And that just, again, builds the goodwill and that relationship as you go down through the process. And, you know, a couple other things just from a basic kind of best practices. Working with the Texas Municipal League is helpful from a city perspective, especially for those smaller cities who may not have the staff or resources to have a dedicated person. TML works very closely, I'm sure, with TLA and other groups to provide information real time, but also TML has an entire process where your city can get involved in helping set the priorities that the Texas Municipal League adopts statewide. So we actually just went through that process at the annual conference for TML. And that's an opportunity where not just the big cities, but cities of all sizes come in and they can propose resolutions. And so if you have a censorship issue or you have something that your organization as a whole is passionate about, that's an opportunity to really bring that up, to be proposed to receive some statewide advocates to join on a particular issue. Another thing, kind of a little bit in the weeds, but something to consider for some communities. When you have a issue specific, a regional specific issue, let's say there's something that's impacting just your community, going to your legislator and explaining that you need a legislative change purely for your area. Those bills are a lot easier to move through the process. I'm sure Sophie can attest than a bill that would impact policy statewide. So if there are opportunities that you have to solve a problem locally rather than introducing it to the legislator as a statewide issue, I'd encourage you to go that route. And even more so than that, taking a step even further back, when you have local issues, do everything in your power to fix them locally. The less opportunity you have to invite the state into your business, generally the better off you are, just because they have a lot of things that they've got to handle from a statewide perspective, and they will appreciate if you're able to come with solutions rather than problems, as Sophie had mentioned. You know, just thinking over a few other items, I think right now, especially in the climate the libraries are having to exist in, it would be really helpful to hear some positive stories. Y'all have, as an industry, you have an amazing set of programs, and y'all are really the fun department. When I think of cities and city departments, y'all are the department that I'm jealous of because you get to have fun. And I'm a book nerd and I love reading. So the idea that I would get to do that all day, I mean, it's awesome. So that being said, share those. Share those not just on your social media sites and in your circles, but take the time to send an email to your representative or to that staffer and highlight, you know, here's something really cool and it's a feel-good thing and it's something that we're doing in your district, in our community. And you may never receive a response to that email, but some staffer or maybe even the representative has read that. And over time, those good things that they keep hearing when something bad or controversial does come up in your industry, in your sector, that will help offset that. And they'll understand that, no, I've seen pretty consistently, we have good things happening in our libraries. So this seems a little off. And so that will help you as you move forward. And the other thing too, advocacy and education doesn't just start down in Austin or at the federal level. It starts with the council. And I say this gingerly with the caveat of make sure you always work through your city manager to be respectful, but your council will really be your advocates for setting those priorities, and oftentimes will be the ones most effective in visiting with legislators and testifying. And so when you're able to educate your council members, we see this issue happening at a statewide or a national level, and here are the things that we're doing, and here are the things that could impact us down the road. It'll help a lot in the long term. But with that, I'll turn it back over to our great moderator, and if you'll have any questions, happy to answer them, and I hope that's been helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I do have to say, because we don't read all day, so I'm sure that was just a slip, but I know
right.
all 33 attendees all went, oh, we don't read all day.
No, and I did not mean to. Y'all do far much more than that. I just to be around books all day.
I made you blush. I'm sorry. To be around books, yes, we are certainly surrounded by books. I love that you said that we have fun. I think that's really true. One of the things I've tried to do here in Fort Worth is to be the good news engine of the city. It's the phrase I use: good news engine of the city. So because especially elected officials, even at the municipal level, all they get are just complaints all the time. And so I figure that the more I can share the good news of what we're doing, when the bad news comes, it's help offset. So it's not just constantly bad news. Amy says, yes, we don't read all day, but it's still the world's greatest job. So I'm sure that's what Andrew meant. Rachel asked a question. This is good, Rachel, because this one was on my list to ask as well. What's the best way to sort of break through that communication wall? Is letter writing effective? I'm wondering about those forms that you fill out that has just the same language from everyone. Is calling the office, that's the one I find the most intimidating, is calling the office, because I know I'm going to have to talk to an actual person. So by far that contact form is the easiest, put out by a petition or something like that. But are we wasting our time with stuff like that?
I certainly in my experience, and Sophie's maybe a little bit different. I found it really depends on the office and the relationship that you have. A lot of the relationships that I have with my representatives, if I really have something important that I need their attention for, I show up in person. And I realize not every community can do that. And thankfully, post-COVID, a lot of people are used to Zooms and they're used to phone calls. If you're able to have an elected official or a staffer agree to a Zoom, again, that face-to-face, you just can't replace it. But a letter is always I use a letter as a follow-up. So I'll have a conversation, but I have my one pager that Sophie described on lock and ready to go. And immediately after that conversation, I say, hey, I end it with saying, I'm sending you a one pager so that you have this written and a record of it. But as much in person or face-to-face as you can get would be my recommendation.
Absolutely agree with Andrew. If you're looking to establish a relationship with someone that you don't have one just yet, I would say calling is the most effective. Hi, I am so-and-so. This is who, what I'm calling about. Who is your staffer that handles public education or municipal issues and everything? Get that staffer's information, set up a meeting, a Zoom or something with them, and then follow up via email. Yes, that second point of contact afterwards is always really critical, I feel, because it keeps you and your topic top of mind for an individual, for a staffer, and for an elected office, because if not, they're dealing with several issues, several fires and everything like that at the same time. And to your point, what Manya was saying and Andrew a little bit, as far as like calling when something good happens too. People really appreciate that. When I answered phones for an elected official's office, I would get screaming constituents all day long. But every once in a while, there's that one person that called just to say like, hey, we saw your boss on the news and he did great. And it would always fill your heart up with a lot of joy that someone has something really positive to say. So also, those are really nice, easy ways to build a relationship that is a negative base when you aren't having a negative problem or anything like that. So yes, definitely call the elected official's office or write a letter that says, hey, just want to say you're doing a great job. They always really appreciate those.
I just had a conversation earlier today with a brand new staffer for a city council member. He said, all I'm doing is answering terrible phone calls with people complaining. And I said, well, people only complain about things that they care about. So think of it like a warm hug, but it is definitely hard. What about, Rachel didn't ask this, but I'll ask this, what about tagging them on social? Is that something that makes any kind of difference? Should we be doing that? I don't mean for advocacy, I mean like programs and things like that.
Yes, with the caveat that sometimes, depending on staff, there is someone monitoring that, or sometimes it is the elected official themselves. So it can be a little hit or miss sometimes. So just if you tag someone on something and you don't get a response, don't feel too bad about it. That doesn't mean that they maybe didn't see it. It just means that they're maybe overwhelmed. But that's also a really great way to share those positive news stories, I would say.
And I'd just tack on, on something like that, it never hurts to just simply ask the staff or ask the legislator and say, hey, I've got these great things I want to share. I was thinking of tagging you on social media with these great stories. Is that something that would be beneficial for you? And they will appreciate you asking for sure.
Great. One of the things we've been doing for Congresswoman Granger is just writing text for her newsletter. So far, she hasn't used it. She hasn't put it at all in her newsletter, but we're going to keep trying because we're playing the long game with her. Let's talk about sort of living in a smaller town or a smaller city where your elected official is really your neighbor and you see them at the grocery store or your kids go to school with them. Do you have any advice for folks who live in those small towns about how to approach or talk to their elected officials in that situation? I mean, I'm assuming they don't want to talk business all the time. So how do you maintain a good balance with advocacy for libraries and what they're working on at the state level versus they just want to live there and buy their watermelon without being talked to about stuff?
Jumping in, I will say as the son of somebody who has been in local government for a long time, as a family member of somebody who had that happen to his dad all the time, the best goodwill you're going to build up is to just simply say hello and not talk shop. And they will remember that so much more than they will remember in a good way. Then they'll say, oh my goodness, here comes so-and-so, and they're going to want to talk my ear off about this or that other, just understanding that we're all people. We all enjoy going to the grocery store in peace, and having a conversation about your kid's football game or about, the weather even is perfectly acceptable. But I think if they lead with it and they say, hey, I saw a letter from you, that's your opening. But as a general rule, it's best to not. But Sophie may have a different perspective or some other comments.
Completely agree with you, Andrew.
Good. So help them remember you by treating them like a human being and doing that as sort of innocuous talk rather than trying to jump right into it. Well, we are pretty much out of time. And so I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Sophie and Andrew. And I'm going to do what Sophie told Wendy and I to do when we had our prep call, which is to give you all a call to action. She said, don't end this webinar without giving them a call to action. So our request of all of you is that you vote, of course, because we always want you to vote. And then when asked by TLA that you contact your local elected official, that means more than anything. And I know that Wendy asks people to do that all the time, and it really is quite meaningful. when you follow through and you do it. So Sophie, Andrew, I don't know if you can drop your contact info into the chat. I cannot post to all participants, so maybe Wendy can do it if y'all can't. But I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you to whoever complimented my cat. That's Oscar. He's an old man and he appreciates being on camera. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Sophie. Wendy, any final parting words?
No, thank you to everybody for attending, and to our panelists. This was excellent and so timely. And so hopefully everybody is inspired to pick up the phone and call their elected officials, or especially after the elections, if you have new people in office, great time to reach out and make those introductions. So thank you all so much. And we'll have the recording posted later this week. Thank you.
Thank you all.